The morning sun peeked through the dusty windows of Sunrise Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Mei Lin moved between tables with the grace of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as she wiped down each surface, preparing for another day of endless coffee refills and scrambled egg orders. 8 years. That's how long she'd been here, watching life unfold through the steam rising from coffee cups and the clinking of silverware against plates. Her regulars knew her as the quiet waitress with the gentle smile, the one who remembered their orders without writing them down. What they didn't know was that her hands, now carrying plates and balancing trays, once created magic on ivory keys. The morning rush began like clockwork. May straightened her name tag, tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and grabbed her order pad. Mr. Kumar from the bookstore wanted his usual black coffee and wheat toast. The construction workers from the site down the street filed in, their yellow vests bright against the diner's muted colors. They always ordered the breakfast special with extra bacon. As she poured coffee and jotted down orders, her fingers moved with an unconscious rhythm. Tap, tap, tap against the order pad. 1, 2, 3 against the coffee pot handle. The kitchen symphony began, sizzling bacon, the whir of the milkshake machine, plates clattering, and the cook's spatula scraping the grill. To most, it was just noise. But to May, it was an orchestra of morning sounds, each playing its part in a complex composition. During quiet moments, when the rush slowed to a trickle, she would catch herself humming. Sometimes it was Chopin, other times Beethoven. The melodies lived in her muscle memory, refusing to fade even after all these years. Her fingers would dance across the counter as she wiped it down, playing invisible keys, remembering the weight and resistance of a piano's action. The other waitresses noticed but never said anything. They'd seen her lost in thought, staring at the old upright piano, gathering dust in the storage room. It was a relic from the diner's early days when they used to host live music on weekend nights. Now it sat silent, surrounded by boxes of paper napkins and spare ketchup bottles. Sometimes, during her breaks, Mai would stand in the storage room doorway, looking at that piano. Its scratched surface and yellowed keys told stories of countless songs played and forgotten. She never touched it, though. That part of her life was packed away as carefully as the sheet music still sitting in boxes under her bed at home. But today felt different. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit the piano's worn wood, or perhaps it was the faint melody of a street musician's song drifting in through the diner's open door. As Mai refilled coffee cups and picked up dropped napkins, her heart beat in time with a rhythm only she could hear. The breakfast rush was ending when she noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fatigue. She was used to the physical demands of waitressing. No, this trembling came from somewhere deeper, like an old friend knocking on a door she'd kept locked for too long. A plate clattered in the kitchen, and the cook rang the bell for an order. Order up! The familiar call snapped Mai back to reality. She grabbed the plates, perfectly balanced on her arm, and headed to table 7. But with each step, each movement, her body remembered a different kind of performance. One that took place under bright lights, before rows of watching eyes, where every motion had to be perfect and precise. The morning went on, and Mai continued her daily routine. But something had shifted, like the first note of a song breaking a long silence. In the rhythm of clinking plates and murmured conversations, in the dance of dodging other waitresses and navigating between tables, music was awakening. And though she didn't know it yet, this ordinary morning at Sunrise Diner was about to become the first measure of a whole new symphony. The Tuesday morning crowd at Sunrise Diner was thinner than usual. Rain tapped against the windows, creating a gentle rhythm that reminded Mai of piano scales. She was refilling sugar dispensers when the bell of the door chimed, and an elderly woman walked in, shaking droplets from her umbrella. The woman chose a booth by the window, her movements careful but graceful. There was something different about her. Maybe it was the way she sat with perfect posture, or how her eyes seemed to take in every detail of the diner with quiet interest. May grabbed a menu and her order pad, making her way over. "Good morning," Mai said, placing the menu down. "Would you like to start with some coffee?" The woman looked up, and Mai noticed her eyes were a warm amber color, bright with intelligence. "Tea, if you have it," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent that Mai couldn't quite place. "And maybe some company if you're not too busy." Mai glanced around the diner. The morning rush was over, and her other tables were settled. "I can spare a few minutes," she said, sliding into the seat across from the woman. It wasn't something she usually did, but something about this customer made her want to stay. "I'm Mrs. Chen," the woman said, then smiled at May's surprised look. "No relation, I assume, though we might share something else in common." She reached across the table and gently took May's hand, turning it palm up. Her fingers traced the calluses that years of waitressing hadn't quite erased. "These aren't just from carrying plates, are they?" Mai pulled her hand back, startled. She hadn't thought anyone would notice, let alone recognize what those marks meant. "I used to play," she admitted quietly, as if sharing a secret. "A long time ago." Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up. "The piano never lets go of us completely, does it? Even when we try to leave it behind." She stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clinking against the cup in perfect quarter notes. "I was at the Central Music Hall yesterday. They're hosting a competition next month. New Beginnings, they're calling it. It's for musicians who left music behind and want to find their way back." Mai's heart skipped a beat. She busied herself with straightening the sugar packets, trying to ignore the way her fingers itched at the mere mention of playing again. "I haven't touched a piano in years," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she thought of the old upright in the storage room. "Sometimes the music waits for us," Mrs. Chen said softly. "Like an old friend, patient and forgiving." She reached into her bag and pulled out a slightly wrinkled flyer, sliding it across the table. "The prize isn't just money. It's a chance to teach at the community center. A way to share music with others who might be afraid to begin." A crash from the kitchen made Mai jump. The cook had dropped a pan, and the sound echoed through the diner like a cymbal crash. She should get back to work, but her eyes kept being drawn to the flyer on the table. "I don't know," Mai started, but Mrs. Chen interrupted her with a gentle wave of her hand. "Just take the flyer," she said. "Music has a way of finding us when we need it most. And sometimes, dear, we need to be brave enough to let it." The rest of Mrs. Chen's visit passed in a blur of tea refills and quiet conversation. When she left, the flyer remained on the table, and Mai found herself slipping it into her apron pocket. Throughout the day, she could feel it there, like a secret burning to be told. That evening, after her shift ended and the dinner crowd had gone, Mai stood in front of the storage room door. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the knob. The old piano waited in the shadows, covered in a thin layer of dust, its keys hidden beneath a faded cloth cover. She took one step forward, then another. 8 years of doubt and fear tried to hold her back, but Mrs. Chen's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes we need to be brave enough to let it. Mai's fingers found the edge of the cloth cover. In the quiet of the empty diner, she could almost hear the music waiting to be played, patient and forgiving, like an old friend welcoming her home. The storage room became Mai's sanctuary during her breaks. After the breakfast rush, when the diner settled into its quiet mid-morning lull, she would slip away with a cup of tea and her determination. The old piano waited for her, patient and unchanging, in the dim light filtered through dusty windows. At first, she just sat there, hands hovering over the keys without touching them. The smell of old wood and memories filled her lungs with each breath. Outside, life at the diner went on. Plates clattered, conversations hummed, and the coffee machine hissed its steady rhythm. One morning, after gathering her courage, she finally lifted the key cover. The ivory keys were yellowed with age, but still smooth under her fingertips. She pressed one key, just middle C, and the note rang out clear and true. The sound made her jump, and she quickly looked over her shoulder, afraid someone might have heard. But nobody came to investigate. The diner's usual sounds continued their daily symphony. Encouraged, May placed both hands on the keys, remembering the proper position her childhood teacher had drilled into her. Her muscles remembered, even after all these years. She started with scales, the most basic exercises every piano student learns first. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, nothing like they used to be. Each wrong note made her wince. But there was something comforting about these simple patterns, like saying hello to an old friend you haven't seen in years. Days passed, and May developed a routine. Wake up early, arrive at the diner before anyone else. Practice for 30 minutes. Another 15 minutes during her lunch break. Sometimes, when the evening shift was slow, she'd sneak in a few more minutes before closing. The cook, Mr. Lee, caught her one day. She was in the middle of practicing Moonlight Sonata, the easiest parts of the first movement, when he opened the door to get some extra napkins. Mee's hands froze on the keys, her face burning with embarrassment. But Mr. Lee just smiled. "I wondered where that beautiful sound was coming from," he said, grabbing his napkins. "It's nice to have some music around here again." He left before she could respond, but after that, she often found a fresh cup of tea waiting for her by the storage room door during her practice times. Other small changes began to appear in her daily life. Her fingers tapped rhythms on the coffee pot handles. She hummed classical pieces while refilling sugar dispensers. She found herself hearing music in everyday sounds. The perfect fourth interval of the door chime, the waltz timing of the ceiling fan, the melodic pattern of regular customers' conversations. One of the younger waitresses, Lily, caught Mai practicing a particularly difficult passage one morning. Instead of walking away, she sat down on an overturned milk crate and listened. "My grandmother used to play," she said after Mai finished. "She always said music was like breathing. You can hold your breath for a long time, but eventually you have to let it out." The competition flyer Mrs. Chen had given her was now pinned to the storage room wall, slightly wrinkled but still readable. 1 month. 4 weeks to prepare a piece she hadn't played in 8 years. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety, but every day the music pulled her back to the piano. Some days were harder than others. Her hands would shake, remembering past failures. The memory of her last recital, the one where everything went wrong, would creep into her mind, making her fingers stumble over simple passages. But then she'd hear the familiar sounds of the diner. The sizzle of bacon on the grill, the clink of coffee cups, the friendly chatter of customers. These everyday sounds grounded her, reminded her that she wasn't on a grand stage anymore. She was just a waitress who was rediscovering something she loved. One afternoon, during a particularly frustrating practice session, she heard soft footsteps behind her. It was Mrs. Chen, holding her usual cup of tea. "Don't stop," she said, settling onto the milk crate. "The music isn't perfect yet, but it's alive again. That's what matters most." Mai turned back to the piano, her hands finding their place on the keys. As she played, the sounds of the diner merged with her music, creating something new. A song that belonged only to this moment, in this unlikely place, where dreams were slowly waking up from their long sleep. 2 weeks before the competition, things started falling apart. The morning began with Mai bringing coffee to the wrong table, her mind still caught in the rhythm of the piece she'd been practicing. She apologized quickly, but it was just the first mistake of many. During the lunch rush, she mixed up 3 orders in a row. Her hands, tired from hours of early morning practice, trembled as she carried plates. A bowl of soup nearly slipped from her grasp, saved only by her quick reflexes. But a few drops splashed onto a customer's newspaper, earning her a stern glare and a complaint to the manager. "May, this isn't like you," her manager, Mr. Wong, said later that afternoon. They stood in his tiny office, the sounds of the diner muffled behind a closed door. 3 customer complaints in 1 week, and now I'm hearing you're spending your breaks in the storage room instead of helping prep for lunch service. Mai stared at her hands, noticing the ink stains from hastily written orders mixed with the returning calluses from piano practice. I'm sorry, she said quietly. It won't happen again. But it did happen again. The next day, she forgot to put in an order for the construction workers who came in every morning. Mr. Lee had to rush their breakfast, the grill sizzling with hurry urgency. The workers were late to their site, and their foreman called to complain. Her coworkers noticed a change in her too. Lily tried to cover for her mistakes when she could, but even she couldn't hide everything. The other waitresses whispered during their breaks, their concerned looks following me as she disappeared into the storage room instead of joining them for lunch. That evening, after another difficult day, Mai sat at the piano. Her fingers moved over the keys, but the music wouldn't come right. Every note reminded her of another mistake, another disappointed customer, another disapproving look from Mr. Wong. As she struggled through a particularly challenging passage, the memory of her last public performance crashed over her like a wave. She had been 16, sitting at a gleaming grand piano under bright lights. The audience was a sea of shadowy faces, waiting. Her hands had frozen over the keys, her mind blank with panic. The silence had stretched on forever until she finally ran from the stage, tears blinding her. The storage room door creaked open, startling her back to the present. It was Mr. Lee, holding 2 cups of tea. You know, he said, setting 1 cup beside her on the piano. When I first started cooking, I burned everything. Rice, vegetables, even water somehow. He chuckled at the memory. My father wanted me to work in his office, said cooking was a waste of time. But I couldn't imagine doing anything else. Mai wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the steam rise between them. How did you get better? Practice, of course, but also accepting that sometimes things go wrong. Food burns. Orders get mixed up. Life goes on. He paused, sipping his tea. The music I hear from this room every day. It's not perfect, but it's real. Like good cooking, it comes from the heart. Before Mai could respond, Mr. Wong's voice carried from the diner. Order up. The moment broke, reality rushing back in. I might lose my job, Mai said quietly, standing up. And even if I don't, the competition. I'm not ready. I'm not good enough. Mr. Lee stood too, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Maybe that's not what matters most. When you're cooking or playing music, you can follow a recipe perfectly and still make something that has no soul. But when you put your heart into it, even the mistakes become part of the story. Mia gathered her things, ready to return to her shift. But before she left, she looked back at the piano. In the dim light, she could almost see her younger self sitting there, full of dreams and fear. The competition was 2 weeks away. Her job was hanging by a thread. And yet, somehow, the music still called to her, as persistent as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The dinner rush waited, full of potential mistakes and small disasters. But for the first time since she'd started practicing again, Mai felt something new beneath the fear, a quiet determination, steady as the ticking of a metronome. Perhaps Mr. Lee was right. Perhaps the story wasn't about being perfect. Perhaps it was about being brave enough to play anyway. The morning light was just beginning to creep through the diner windows when Mrs. Chen arrived, earlier than usual. Mai was wiping down tables, her movements mechanical, tired from another early practice session. The competition was now just 10 days away. Sit with me, Mrs. Chen said, not as a question but a gentle command. She chose her usual booth by the window, where the sunrise painted everything in soft gold. You look like someone carrying too many plates at once. Mi glanced around the empty diner and slid into the booth. Her hands smelled of cleaning solution and piano keys. I'm not sure I can do this anymore, she admitted quietly. Everything's falling apart. Mrs. Chen didn't respond immediately. Instead, She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds around them. The coffee maker gurgling to life, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant scrape of Mr. Lee's spatula on the grill as he prepared for the morning rush. "What do you hear?" she asked finally, opening her eyes. Mai frowned, confused. "Just the usual diner sounds." "Listen again. But this time, listen like a musician." Mai closed her eyes, uncertain but willing to try. The coffee maker gurgled in a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The ceiling fan clicked in perfect quarter notes. The sizzle of bacon provided a constant background note, like strings in an orchestra. "Now," Mrs. Chen said, "tell me about the piece you're practicing for the competition." "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major," Mai replied. "But I can't get the timing right. The left hand needs to be so steady while the right hand flows above it, and I keep." "Like carrying plates," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "One hand steady, the other flowing between tables. Haven't you been practicing this dance every day for 8 years?" Mi's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. Mrs. Chen smiled and continued. "The rhythm of your walk between tables, that's your metronome. The balance of a full coffee pot, that's your left hand's steady bass line. The way you dodge and weave between customers, that's your right hand's melody, flowing above it all." The morning light grew stronger as they sat there, the diner slowly coming to life around them. Mr. Lee began humming as he cooked, his spatula still keeping time on the grill. The door chime rang out as the first customers arrived. A perfect interval, just like always. "But what about the pressure?" Maya asked. "The competition." "Tell me," Mrs. Chen leaned forward, "what happens when you drop a plate?" "I clean it up and keep going. There's no choice. People are waiting for their food." "Exactly. No one expects perfection, dear. They just expect you to keep going. Music is the same way. A dropped note, like a dropped plate, isn't the end of the world. It's just part of the performance." The morning rush began to trickle in. Mai watched as Lily greeted customers, her movements creating her own kind of dance through the diner. Everything Mrs. Chen said began to make sense. The diner wasn't just a distraction from her music, it was teaching her everything she needed to know. "Watch," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing to the busy diner. "The breakfast rush is your symphony. The orders are your sheet music. Your feet know the rhythm without thinking. Your hands remember the weight and balance without trying. You've been practicing this piece for years without realizing it." For the first time in weeks, Mai felt the knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. She stood up, straightening her apron with newfound purpose. The diner was filling up, but instead of seeing chaos, she saw music. The clink of cutlery became high notes, the murmur of conversation a warm chord progression, the sizzle of the grill a percussion line that held it all together. That afternoon, during her practice break, Mai sat at the piano differently. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the diner flow through her. Her left hand found the steady rhythm of her daily walks between tables. Her right hand floated above, telling the story of 8 years of carried plates and poured coffee and small kindnesses. The music finally made sense. It wasn't about escaping her life as a waitress. It was about finding the beauty in it, the rhythm and flow that had been there all along. As she played, the boundary between her two worlds began to blur, creating something new. A song that tasted like coffee and smelled like bacon and felt like sunrise through dusty windows. For the first time since she'd started practicing again, Mai smiled as she played. She was still a waitress, and she was still a pianist, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what her music needed to be real. The morning of the competition dawned clear and bright. Mai arrived at the diner early as usual, but today she wore her waitress uniform under a simple black dress. Her competition piece was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Central Music Hall, but she couldn't imagine not working the morning shift. These familiar routines had become part of her music. The regulars noticed something different about her. Mr. Kumar, reading his morning paper over black coffee, looked up and asked, "Big day?" May nodded, pouring his coffee with hands that trembled just slightly. Word had spread through the diner about the competition, and throughout the morning, customers offered quiet words of encouragement. The construction workers left a tip with a note that read, "Break a leg," written on a napkin. At noon, she hung up her apron. Mr. Lee appeared from the kitchen with a small container. "Dumplings," he said. "My mother always said you can't play on an empty stomach." The other waitresses hugged her, and Lily promised to cover her afternoon tables. Mr. Wong, who had been quiet all morning, finally spoke up. "The diner will be short-staffed today," he said gruffly. Then, surprising everyone, he added, "Because we're closing early. Can't miss our waitress's big performance." The central music hall loomed before her, all polished stone and gleaming windows. May clutched her music sheets, the paper warm and slightly crumpled from being in her apron pocket during the morning rush. In the entrance hall, other competitors paced in elegant clothes, many practicing finger movements in the air. She found a quiet corner and opened Mr. Lee's container, the familiar smell of ginger and soy sauce helping to calm her nerves. As she ate, she watched the other musicians. They all looked so polished, so professional. She touched her waitress uniform under her dress, drawing comfort from the familiar fabric. "Number 23, Mai Lin, you're up in 5 minutes," a coordinator announced. Mi's heart jumped. She closed her eyes and listened, really listened, just as Mrs. Chen had taught her. Even here, there was music, the whisper of papers being shuffled, the tap of shoes on marble floors, the distant sound of another pianist playing. Backstage, she peeked through the curtain. Her heart nearly stopped. The diner crew had taken up an entire row. Mr. Lee still in his cooking apron, Lily and the other waitresses in their uniforms. Even Mr. Wong wearing his usual stern expression. Mrs. Chen sat with them, looking perfectly at home among the breakfast crew. "Number 23, please take the stage." Mai walked out, her waitress shoes silent on the polished floor. The grand piano waited, its surface reflecting the stage lights like the diner's countertop at sunrise. She sat, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. The silence pressed in, heavy with expectation. Her hands hovered over the keys, and for a moment, she was 16 again, frozen with fear. But then, she heard it. The distant clink of coffee cups, the rhythm of footsteps between tables, the sizzle of bacon on the grill. 8 years of music disguised as ordinary life. She began to play. The nocturne flowed from her fingers, but it wasn't just Chopin anymore. It was the sound of early mornings and fresh coffee, of kindness served with scrambled eggs, of dreams kept alive between orders and cleanups. Her left hand kept the steady rhythm of a waitress's walk, while her right hand told stories of tiny moments. A shared smile, a perfectly timed refill, the way sunlight turned coffee steam into gold. When she stumbled over a difficult passage, she didn't freeze. She heard Mr. Lee's voice in her head. Sometimes things go wrong. Life goes on. She kept playing, letting the mistake become part of the story, just like a dropped plate or a mixed-up order. The final notes hung in the air like the last wisps of steam from an empty coffee cup. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, from the back of the hall, she heard a familiar sound. Mr. Lee's cooking spoon tapping against a pot lid, keeping time just like he did every morning. The applause that followed wasn't polite or reserved. It was warm and real, like a busy diner on a Sunday morning. As Mai stood to bow, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the piano's surface. She saw both versions of herself there, the waitress and the pianist, finally playing in perfect harmony. The piece might not win first prize, but for the first time in her life, she had played her own true music. The next morning, Mai opened the diner just like always. She wiped down tables, started the coffee maker, and checked the syrup dispensers. But something was different. The third-place certificate from the competition sat quietly in her apron pocket, a reminder that yesterday hadn't been a dream. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its golden glow. Mr. Lee was already in the kitchen, humming as he prepped for breakfast. The smell of cooking bacon filled the air, its sizzle creating a familiar rhythm that now, to May's ears, sounded exactly like the left-hand pattern of her chop and piece. The regulars started arriving, each one asking about the competition. Mr. Kumar brought in a local newspaper that mentioned the event, with a small photo of all the winners. There she was, still in her waitress uniform under her dress, standing among the other musicians. Third place isn't bad at all, Mr. Wong said as he put up the day's specials. Not bad for a waitress. But he said it with a smile, and Mai noticed he added something new to the menu board. Live piano music, weekend evenings. During her break, Mai found Mrs. Chen waiting in her usual booth. But today, she wasn't alone. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, sat nervously beside her. "This is my granddaughter," Mrs. Chen explained. "She loves music, but has been too scared to try lessons." I told her about a waitress who found her courage again. The girl looked up at Mai with hopeful eyes. "Could you teach me?" she asked quietly. Mai thought about the community center, where she'd been offered a part-time position teaching beginner piano classes. But as she looked around the diner, at the place that had shaped her music in ways she never expected, an idea began to form. "What if," she said slowly, "we used the piano in the storage room? You could come after school, before the dinner rush. And maybe," she smiled, remembering her own journey, "we could learn to hear the music in everyday things." Word spread quickly. Within a week, 3 more students had asked about lessons. Mr. Wong cleared out the storage room, moving boxes to make space for a small waiting area. Mr. Lee started making special after-school snacks for the young musicians. Even Lily asked if she could learn a few basic pieces. The old piano, once gathering dust, now sang throughout the day. Between taking orders and serving plates, Mai would catch snippets of her students practicing. Their simple melodies mixed with the diner's usual symphony, coffee cups clinking, plates being stacked, conversations humming, all creating a new kind of music. One evening, as the sun was setting and the last customers were finishing their meals, Mai sat at the piano. Her fingers found the keys without thinking, playing a gentle melody that floated through the diner. A few customers stopped their conversations to listen. Others continued eating, letting the music become part of their meal. Mr. Lee appeared with a fresh pot of tea, setting it on top of the piano, just like he used to during her practice sessions. "You know," he said, "I think the food tastes better with music." Mai smiled, her hands still moving over the keys. She was playing something new, a piece she'd been working on that borrowed rhythms from the breakfast rush and melodies from quiet afternoon lulls. It wasn't classical music anymore, but it wasn't just diner sounds either. It was something in between, something uniquely hers. The door chime rang out its perfect interval as new customers entered. Mai could hear Lily greeting them, her voice adding another layer to the evening's composition. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pie filled the air. Through the windows, the streetlights were coming on one by one, like notes on a sheet of music. She didn't win first place in the competition, but she had found something more valuable. A way to make music part of her everyday life, and a chance to help others find their own songs. Every morning, she still put on her waitress uniform, filled coffee cups, and carried plates. But now she also taught children to hear the music in the world around them, just as she had learned to do. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was a place where music and life danced together, where dreams didn't have to be grand to be meaningful, and where a waitress could play both tables and piano keys with equal grace. As she finished her song, May realized that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, finding your way back to a dream means discovering that you never really left it behind at all.